Hey everyone, and welcome to the Study Chronicles. Today we're going to be going over 3-bet pots. Very exciting episode because 3-bet pots are something that a lot of people have requested I go over. And today we are going to cover the button versus the small blind from the small blind's perspective. So just as we have in past episodes, we're going to go over the pre-flop ranges, and then we're going to go over some drills to mimic the scenario in game. This is a really unique scenario when it comes to evaluating some of the ranges. You'll see that playing against tighter 3-bet spots with smaller SPRs are going to provide for some interesting heuristics. So I hope that you guys enjoy. Let's jump right in. We're going to go over the GTO Wizard pre-flop ranges as per usual. So pull up right here. The action is going to be button raise and small blind 3-bets. For the raise size, we're having a 2.5x raise from the button, and then we're going to have a 12 big blind 3-bet out of the small blind. Now you can opt to choose a smaller size. I like to use these solutions, so I typically use 12 big blinds for 3-bets. You can also have a 3-bet only range out of the small blind. A lot of people prefer that, especially if they're playing in high rake games. You'll see that the solver does prefer more 3-betting the higher the rake, but for the sake of my own strategy, I do have a flatting range out of the small blind. I'm probably flatting even a bit too much because I know that it's incorporated into my strategy. And so sometimes when I roll my RNG, I overcompensate for calling. But 3-betting is going to be the focus of today's video. So we're going to look at all of the 3-betting ranges. And if you do have a 3-bet only range, it's going to be a bit different than mine. You can choose the simple ranges in GTO Wizard if you wanted to have a 3-bet only range to compare what they look like. But again, we're going to use these ones here. So what are we going to 3-bet versus a 2.5x open? Well, let's take a look. Pocket sixes is going to be the threshold hand for the pocket pairs. I always like to have an idea of what the worst pocket pair is for 3-betting. It just gives me a base idea of where my range is going to be at. We have some weaker suited kings like King 8, King 7, King 6. Ace 3 suited seems to be the bottom for suited aces. And then we have offsuit Broadway cards like Ace 10 and King 10. So there aren't too many combos here to worry about. 3-bet ranges are very linear from the small blind. So you can see here this linear kind of shape where we're picking the most strong hands and working our way down. The suited connectors are all connected and very strong. And so that's going to be the range morphology of our 3-bet range from the small blind. That's going to be different when we get to the big blind, but we're going to talk about that when we get there. So for now, we're just worrying about the small blind. We're going to have this kind of linear 3-bet range, suited 9s, suited broadways, aces down through 6s. And that's going to be what we're working with for post flop. So after we 3-bets, the button's continuing range, which is interesting to look at because it's going to help us make our decisions post flop. So we can select call here. We're not going to worry about the big blinds 4-bet or anything for now. We're just going to look at the continuing range for what is continuing against a 3-bet. And that's going to be somewhat capped. I say somewhat because there are some sneaky hands in the button's calling range, like pocket aces that are slow playing in position, pocket queens, which are just very strong in position, and even pocket jacks. So they do have a lot of strong hands in the calling range, which means you have a very unique scenario in which sometimes we're going to have to play more passive, given the fact that they have these traps. But for the most part, we're going to see a lot of weaker hands continue here, like deuces all the way through 9s are going to be a fairly high frequency continue. You have some suited broadways, you have some offsuit broadways as well, just like the other range. So you have, this similar ranges for 3-betting and also for calling. But one thing that will set them apart is this range over here. You'll see that the button actually has a lot more suited connections connectors, 9-8 down to 7-6, than the small blind does for 3-betting. So you can see kind of a lack of these combos down here. So those kinds of textures are going to be the ones to look out for in 3-bet pots, where maybe the button actually has an advantage over the small blind. If we see textures kind of like 7-6-5, 5-6-4, etc. So we'll have a look at that when we go through the drills. That being said, let's jump into the drills. So I've created a small blind versus button 3-bet spots, and we can just start the drill right here. So this is going to put us into the small blind perspective in the 3-bet scenario, and we can start training right here. So before we even look at this hand, we need to know what our overall strategy is going to look like. Let's pull up the aggregated reports for 3-bet pots out of the small blind. So pulling up the reports, we'll find these are the sizings that we're going to use the most in a 3-bet pot, and you can see every sizing is being used at a decent frequency. Bet small all the way up to bet large. You have 14% at betting large. You have 22% at betting 20%, and 13.2% for betting small. So if you wanted to group these, it might be a little bit easier to see. That we're betting small 35.6%, we're betting medium 15%, and betting large about 14%. So we are in fact betting small the most frequent, but we are mixing in these medium and larger sizings, which can provide for some interesting hands, especially in 3-bet pots. I think a lot of players typically have been taught to just c-bet small after 3-betting, which is wrong. You do have some scenarios where you're going to c-bet small at a very high frequency. However, there are a lot of scenarios where you need to use larger sizings, perhaps because you have a big overpair advantage, perhaps because villain is going to have a hard time continuing versus these large sizings. But the solver is just worried about EV and equity, right? So oftentimes it's the highest equity decision in our highest EV decision to bet large. And so we're going to have a look at that too. Check is only 33.9%, so a majority of the time we are going to continuation bet here, which again might be a bit more aggressive than something like the big blind, but we'll get to that again in another episode. So we're just worried about being aggressive out of the small blind in a 3-bet pot. Let's have a look. So all that being said, 5-4-2, this is kind of that texture I was referring to, where the button might have more strong hands than the small blind here. Yes, we have all the overpairs. Yes, we have suited aces. However, button is going to have pocket 2s, pocket 4s, and pocket 5s at a frequency, and we don't. We don't even have pocket 5s as we saw in a 3-bet pot. Pocket 6s was our threshold for 3-betting. So this kind of texture is going to be one I assume we're going to have a very high frequency check on, because we do have aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, etc., and 2 overcards. However, most of our range, I think, isn't really happy about betting 3 streets, except for maybe aces and kings. And as we know, button does still have those aces in their trap range as well. So I think we are going to have a majority check. This hand plays very well as a check because we can either check raise or check call. We have showdown value with ace jack high. So I think this one is going to be a high frequency check. And just to double check our heuristics, we can have a look at the small blind decision here, and we can see, in fact, we are checking at a 67% frequency, which is high because we know that the global check frequency is about 34%. And if we wanted to dive in a bit deeper, we can see in the range comparison that the small blind doesn't have that big of a best hands advantage here over the button, and the equity is also fairly close together, but for the most part, these good hands are going to consist of a lot of combos for both sides. And typically, if we have a large amount of good hands in our range, we want to do a lot of checking. So again, that makes a lot of sense for having this check on this kind of texture. And versus a bet, I think we have 2 options. We can either check raise or check call. So my first question is, what size do we check raise? Well, again, we can pull up the aggregated reports since this is still on the flop, and we can have a look at our strategy. So against a small bet, which I think is going to be the most common sizing for the button when check two. Button can use mostly a 20 or 33% sizing. They are going to have some 50% sizings, but for the most part, it's going to be these small bets here. So against a small bet, what is our most common check raise sizing? It looks like it's going to be a 35% check raise most commonly, and we also have a 55% sizing to use. However, that doesn't seem to be a fairly high frequency scenario. The 35% is going to be favored, and so in this spot, I think that this hand makes a lot of sense to check raise. It has a ton of equity. We are likely going to be getting it in as a favorite even against pocket, 8s, 9s, 10s, or whatever they might have. That being said, this hand also has some showdown value. So as an extreme example, I think ace king of spades might pure check call, and then a hand like ace jack suited might mix between check raise and check call. So this time I am going to check raise. And it looks like, interestingly, we want to check jam. This is surprising to me. I guess against the 33% sizing, we're more incentivized than the 20% sizing to be aggressive, but I did not expect to have a check jam range. This might be a very unique board to do so on. Let's take a look. Now that I say that, I am remembering studying a spot similar to this, and there was a lot of check jamming on it. So I guess that does make sense. This is one of the few boards I think we even have a check jam on. So right away, we get into a pretty cool spot that is not going to be very common. As you can see, this 0.06% of check jam, 0.6%, sorry, very uncommon. And it looks like most of the board textures in which this happens are boards like 5-4-2 and then the Jack 10 boards. So like 3 wheel cards or a texture with Jack 10, Queen Jack. And that tells me that the small blind is going to have a lot of hands that have good equity on textures like that. So a lot of ace high combos on 5-4-2, I imagine, are going to want to check jam if we are having a check jam strategy. Some mid pocket pair, we have a lot of over pairs, and I think this is where this check jam is coming from, right? Is that we have this big advantage of over pairs versus the button. So we have a lot more hands like queens, aces, kings, ace jack suited, ace queen suited, maybe at a slight advantage. Not really for those ones, but you get the picture. But it is surprising how often we're check jamming here when we do continue. There is a raised 35%, but it doesn't seem like ace jack wants to be in there. It looks like it's more about ace queen suited being in there or ace king suited. So I guess ace jack is in that like happy medium spot where it's one of the few combos that we're actually check jamming. So I wasn't making a big mistake by check raising the 35% sizing here. You can see the EV is 2633 and here it's 2646, which is significant, but it's not like a huge blunder. But yeah, this is new. This is new for me. I have seen this in the past, but it's been a while since I've studied 3-bet pots, so it's pretty cool to see this again. I'm learning along with you guys that this is that high of a frequency of a check jam, but it does make sense. We have a lot of these combos that do very well check jamming. Ace high combos especially are always going to perform well in a check jam scenario here because the button is going to have to call a lot of weaker hands like pocket 7s, pocket 6s, maybe for the jamming. So yeah, you can see here, if we do jam, villain has to pay off with pocket 6s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s. And if we have something like ace jack or ace queen or ace king, those hands have a lot of equity against those combos, right? They also have to call hands like ace 9 suited, which ace jack actually has value against, right? Same thing with some king high suited combos. So the button is being put in a really awkward spot when we do check jam. Makes a lot of sense. And I'm just going to jam here just to finish this hand. Villain had queens this time. Okay, next hand. So king 9-5. This is a much different texture. This is a texture that hits our range very well. In fact, I think we're going to see range bets to the tune of small betting. So we're either going to use the 20% or the 33%. We can also mix in 50%. I think just as our strategy is going to have a lot of really strong hands. As we see here, we have ace king. So I think we can use the 50% here. I'm going to go for it. Although I think a majority of our range wants to 20 or 33. I'm trying to think, if this is a pure range bet, then I think 33 might be the largest size that we can use if it is in fact a range bet. So let's go with the safe bet and use 33. We can in fact use 50, but I think we will see that our range wants to go ahead and c-bet here. Yeah, so we do have just about a range bet. We have this 2.1% check with a hand like a7 of clubs. That's the one hand that really wants to check a lot. But for the most part, we can range bet. And you can see that the 50% is being used at a significant frequency. So medium or small betting on this texture is good. And we have one of the hands that fits very well into the larger sizing of the options. So it does make sense to use that 50%. Next hand, king, queen, 7, same exact idea. I think this is a board in which we're going to have a lot of pure c-bets. And now the one thing that's different here is that this hand wants to small bet because this isn't a hand that wants to go 3 streets. It doesn't want to be in a polarized range. If anything, it wants to check. Right? Because we want to get to showdown. We don't get a lot of value. However, our range just performs so well on this texture. So I think we're going to see this 20% sizing a majority of the time. And we do. There is an interesting bet 75 here, which I am assuming is going to turn this hand into a bluff on some certain runouts. So let's say we bet 75 and then a jack or a 9 or an ace comes off. This hand might be then used in that type of range as a bluff. So the solver is always thinking ahead, right? It works backwards. So in this regard, you might see some strange bets that don't make a lot of sense. But then if you see certain runouts, it'll make sense now that we were setting up for those runouts to have these kinds of bluffs. So you will see some outlier bluffs with these combos. But for the most part, you want to just use 20% or 33. So on turn, I think at this point, we have an interesting heuristic. Whenever you bet your range, you're going to do a lot of checking on the turn, unless the card is good for you. So this card is going to be considered a brick, which means the continuing range of the button now is probably stronger than our range c-bet as the 3-better, which means we're going to do a lot of checking. So in this scenario, I am going to check with this combo, as well as other medium strength combos like pocket jacks, weak queen X, maybe some ace highs that don't have much equity. There's a lot of combos that can check here. I do think that because our range is just so strong on a king, queen, 7 board, we'll see a lot of continuation bets just because we have a lot of strong hands, but we don't need to continuation bet all of those medium strength hands along with it. So I'm going to go ahead and check this time. We do see a small bet continuation here, which is interesting. I don't know exactly why that is, but let's find out real quick. Maybe it is a very thin value bet. Maybe it is one of those scenarios where we don't want to check call, but we don't want to check fold. So maybe we're going to put in a small bet instead. Maybe we're setting up for a river bluff. Again, if a jack or an ace or a 9 comes off, thinking ahead, we could be setting ourselves up for a bluff here. And the way we can figure out what the solver is trying to do is we can look through the filters, right? We can figure out what kind of category is 10s in. Is this in our best hands category? Because if it is, these are the hands typically that we're going to bet 3 streets or that we're really happy value betting. If not, are they in the trash hands? These are the hands that aren't really happy about trying to get to showdown, and are probably turning themselves into a bluff, right? Weak hands are unique in that sometimes they fall into either category of like trying to get to showdown or maybe turning themselves into a bluff, depending on how much equity they have. Typically, you'll see a lot of flush draws in weak hands, but for this scenario, when on a rainbow board, you're not going to see very much equity in the weak hands. So nines falls right into that weak hand category, which means tens is probably going to be in the good hands category, and it is. So this is a good hand. So this is one of those kind of mergey scenarios where the good hands are continuation betting here. Perhaps it's for, value. Perhaps it's setting up for some river bluffs. The way we can find out is just follow the line, right? So if we bet 33 and villain calls and river is a complete brick, what are we doing with tens? I would assume we're checking or small betting. So we're completely checking on the river on a deuce. Okay, so that makes sense into where maybe on the turn we're betting again for protection / value, and then we're just trying to get to showdown. And I think we'll see the button has to continue here with weaker hands than pocket tens. I think we're going to see, if we look through here, that villain is going to have to continue with all of these suited connectors here, 8, 7, 7, 6, 6, 5, which are one pair that we beat. Also hands like pocket nines, pocket eights. You have some ace highs that we're ahead of, ace jack, ace 10, ace 7, ace 5. So there's actually a good amount of hands that pocket tens is ahead of here, which then would make sense as to why we're betting the turn, right? So small bet on turn does make sense. And then on the river, let's see if we are going to maybe turn our hand into a bluff on something like, an ace on the river. Now maybe we'll see tens come alive as a bluff, and we do see a little bit of bet here for the smaller sizing, and I can guarantee you that we don't have a good hand anymore. So you look at the trash hands, and tens is now in the trash hands, and that's where some of our bluffs are going to come from on an ace river. What happens if there's a jack river? Now tens all of a sudden is jamming. So I was right in that tens is setting up for some river bluffs all the way back to the flop. And that's how you have to kind of think like a solver. You have to think, okay, on what runouts is this hand going to make sense to start using as a bluff? Are there any? Yeah. Okay. So maybe we should throw in a small bet on the flop at some frequency, because this is a perfect hand to use as a bluff. Because if we do jam river on a river card like this, a lot of buttons calls are going to come from 10x. So queen 10 and 10 9 are a majority of their calls, and that's what you're going to see. Here's the full range. Sorry, I forgot to do that. There you go. So you have like, king 10, ace 10, queen 10, jack 10, 10 9. So anything with a 10 in it, we're now blocking a lot of their calling range, right? So it's that's how you kind of have to think like the solver in a way, is just make sure you're thinking about the entire run out, not just your flop strategy separate from your turn strategy, separate from your river strategy. Okay, let's continue. Versus large size, I'm going to fold, but I am surprised to see that this is as high of a frequency call as it is. I guess, again, we saw what they can get to the turn with. They probably have a lot of weak and trash hands as well. So yeah, going to fold this one, but they did turn ace jack into a bluff. King jack, ace 7 4. Now this is a unique scenario. Ace high boards are very interesting, because out of the small blind, we know that we have a linear range, which has a lot of medium strength hands in it on a texture like this. So we have a lot of suited broadways. We have a lot of pocket jacks, pocket tens, pocket nines, pocket queens, etc. And so I think we actually have a mix of check and small bet on a texture like this. You don't typically want to go larger than 50% or a medium sizing on this kind of texture. And it's going to be very polarized if you do use the medium sizing. So this particular hand, I think, makes sense to do a lot of checking. We rolled a large number. I'm going to be passive here, but we can include this in a small sizing and a little bit of a medium sizing. But again, let's take a quick look at what our entire range wants to do. So we'll see here that the range wants to do a lot of small betting, which makes sense. We have hands that all have a lot of good equity. If we look at the range breakdown, we have a significant amount of best hands along with good hands. Makes sense to have this 20% sizing. Also, villain is going to miss this board a lot, right? The button is going to have a lot of those medium strength hands that just have to fold flop. And so it makes sense that we have a good spot to go small because they're just going to be very polarized in their continuing range a lot of the time, where they either have an ace, maybe they have some mid pocket pairs at a frequency, but they're going to brick this board at a very high frequency. As you can see here, 70% of the range is going to be weaker trash hands. And so we don't need to go large with our, medium strength hands. We're going to often check. And so for this scenario, I am just going to check fold. You can see there is some check call here because we have some showdown value with King Jack. Unsurprisingly, a lot of their bluffs are going to be like 5-6, maybe 8-9 suited, maybe 10-9 suited. So King Jack high has value, but for the most part, we're going to see a fold. Moving on, King Queen 8. So another spot where we have a medium strength hand on a range bet board. So I think I'm going to choose the 20% sizing here. And we get raised. So what is our response to getting raised on the flop? Well, on a texture like this, I think villain's going to have to be very polarized. I don't think we're going to see too much raising, although we have a lot of strong hands. So let's have a look. What are we going to do against a raise versus our c-bet? I think the answer is most commonly call, but we might see a more polarized range for 3-betting here. And we do have a 3-bet, and we will see, to no surprise, that it's going to contain hands like King Queen, pocket aces, Ace King at a frequency, a little bit of King Jack and King 10. But the bluffs are going to be hands like Jack 9, something like 10-8, that's blocking bottom set, 10-9. So gut shots that also have some kind of blocking properties are good. Something like Ace Jack or Ace 10. So typically the weaker hands for 3-betting are going to come from the gut shots that still have some kind of equity if they're called. And then you have some like interesting semi bluffs like Queen Jack suited, which are blocking a lot of really strong hands that villain can have, but also maybe get some better hands to fold here. Right? So if we're blocking something like Queen Jack of clubs, we're blocking them from having pocket queens. We're blocking them from having King Queen suited. We're blocking them from having, I don't think they're going to have Queen 8 suited, but yeah. So in these cases, you end up having this weird like mergey bluff kind of hand that has value against their continuing range because some of their weaker hands still have to continue here. So we're ahead of those and we're blocking the top of their range. So it makes sense that because we're blocking the top of their range, we're going to face a lot of weaker hands with this hand, if that makes any sense. So I assume we have some 3-bets here. And then if villain continues on a brick river, maybe now Queen Jack is going to turn into a bluff catcher because villain has to continue with all of those weak hands, right? Like Ace Jack and Ace 10 suited that maybe had a backdoor that got, aggressive on the flop. Maybe they have like 8x, they were turning into a bluff or something. And so now we're ahead of those combos. And if we see when we check and button goes for an all-in, they have to go all in with a hand like Ace 10, Ace Jack, Ace 8, Jack 10, Ace Jack, 8-7, and we're ahead of all of those combos. So we're going to see something interesting when we check. We're going to use that Queen Jack after 3-betting the flop, bluff catch the river. So like following the line again is really important to understanding how the solver is thinking. Just because a hand looks kind of strange to you, it'll make sense if you follow the line and try and put it all together. Okay, Queen Jack suited. I am going to call though. This hand We'd rather use the clubs combo because that's the one that's blocking the most combinations, right? Especially because the jack of diamonds is not blocking hands, as much as the jack of clubs might be. So for example, the button might rather call king jack of diamonds on the flop instead of raising it, and the jack of clubs would block those combos. Speaking of the jack of clubs, there it is. I don't know if we want to lead the turn. Gonna check here, but we do have a lead at a frequency. Goes check, check, and the worst card for this hand, other than a 10 and an ace, come off. I think we're just gonna check, and we're back into bluff catching mode, but they did have ace queen there. And interesting because they ended up using that same idea with ace queen of clubs, right? So in position, they raised for value with ace queen of clubs again, because they were blocking all of our strong hands and unblocking the weak hands that had to continue. So they were getting value from the ace queen, having a good hand that they could check back on the turn and river and bluff catch with. 10-7-2, this will be the last hand we go over. I think this is a good texture to go large or check on. We have a lot of those overpairs, similar to the deuce 3-4 type board that we looked at earlier. I think we want to play aggressive with a lot of our overpairs. We have a lot of 10x. Yeah, I think we're going to go large or check, and we rolled low here. The only problem is we have a club in our hand, which is bad. We don't want clubs because it's not blocking the continuation range of the button. So having a jack of diamonds is important here because button is going to continue with something like ace jack of diamonds, king jack of diamonds, queen jack of diamonds, etc. So blocking the continuing range of the button is better for us to go ahead and c-bet. So when we have the club, I want to check. However, we rolled such an aggressive number, and I don't think that this is going to be 100% check. But maybe it is. Maybe it is. Let's go with the safe bet and check. That's kind of a weird... It's not a double entendre. It's something. The safe bet is to check. You know what I mean? Okay. Anyway, going forward. Check is good here. You do see this large sizing or the 50% sizing. So I was right in the sense of we're going to go large or check most of the time. And so, yeah, so we are going to mix in some large sizing. Having the jack does still block pocket jacks for villain, does still block jack 10 suited, does still block a lot of their continuing range. And so that's going to be why we see this in there at a frequency. And against their continuing range, we do have some equity. So if they do call something like 7x or 10x or pocket 8s or pocket 9s, we do have 2 overcards as equity. So check is good. Bet is also fine. Versus a bet, I think we now have an option of either check fold or check call, maybe even check raise. Because I'm indifferent here, usually the solver ends up having a check raise or a check call or fold. Like usually it's all 3 options when I'm thinking to myself, I could have all 3 options here. The solver is pretty close behind in making that decision. So I am going to, against a small bet, I think I'm going to fold this time at 53 RNG. But I could see all of the options being viable here. So going to fold, and we do see a little bit of raise, not so much calling. So this hand is not good for calling, which makes sense because we don't have much equity out of position. We're not going to realize our equity, first of all, out of position very often. It's hard to realize equity because the button is able to just control the action against us. And the only way to realize our equity is to go all in, but this hand doesn't really have enough equity to go all in a lot of turns. So it makes sense that we're going to have a lot of either check folds or continue with a small raise frequency here of raise 35. Now, if we did have something like ace jack of diamonds, maybe that would shift our decision into the check call or the check raise more frequently. So if we see here against the small bet, if we do have ace jack, you'll see now we're not folding ever. And that's because we have more equity, we can realize it more often. But another interesting thing that you see is the solver wants to continue 100% with ace jack of clubs. You can't see it because my head is in the way. Here, let me just do this real quick. You can see ace jack of clubs is actually 100% continue. And the solver does like to choose the suited combos more often for continuing than the offsuit combos, because it better blocks hands like Jack 10 or Ace 10 on the 10 of spades, right? So if we have an ace of clubs or a jack of clubs in our hand, but we have a spade as the other card, that's not going to block ace 10 as well as something like ace jack of clubs. So if you're going to turn your hand into a bluff, you want to have the suited combo most of the time. We saw that with the ace queen of clubs in the last hand for the button as a raise. We saw that with the queen jack of clubs in our 3-bet hand on that same flop from the last hand. So usually, as a heuristic, the solver is going to want to pick the suited hands that do better for blocking the top end of villain's range. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Study Chronicles. I hope you guys enjoyed the 3-bet pots. We're getting into them now. So we're going to be covering a bunch of different 3-bet spots coming forward. And I'm going to update the spot importance sheet. We're going to drill these 3-bet pots. And by the end of it, I hope that you guys are going to feel a lot more comfortable playing in these scenarios. Please like and subscribe if you want to continue seeing this kind of content. It really helps support me. And I will see you guys on the next one.